you've watched any of my other videos, I talk a lot about this concept of like a George Washington moment, or these moments where George Washington moment, because he was president, right, for 2 terms. He could have stayed president for 3, 4, who knows how many terms. People wanted him to. Everything pushed him in that direction. He was incentivized, he was motivated, he was justified to do it, but he didn't. And seemingly because he believed it was better for the country, right? So those moments and how important they are. And from a mathematical perspective, I always say it, all the math adds up and says you should do X. But somehow you realize like, no, I'm gonna do Y because that's the right thing to do. That's tricky though, right? From a mathematical perspective, because if what I'm saying is true, where all the math tells you X, but I'm saying you should do Y, it's like, well why should I do Y? Right? Like, what's the logic? What's the math behind it? If the math tells me X, then it's probably what I should do. And how would I know, right? How do I know if X actually is the right thing? Like in some situations, seemingly that would be the right thing where the math checks out. Do I just always do the opposite? It gets really tricky. What I've started to realize is I think, much like that George Washington moment, power becomes such a key component of it, right? So you take the George Washington situation, there was a power dynamic there. He was in power. He had the power to do it. The risk of him staying in office, the cost to him was zero, right? He could have stayed in power for as long as he wanted to. And there was no risk, there was no cost. When that power dynamic is present, when the power is in your favor, and this isn't a binary thing, it's not an absolute thing to say this is always the case. What we're always trying to do here is get more clarity so we can make the best decisions. So what I'm saying is when you have that situation where everything in the math seems to point towards X, you have to ask yourself and look, is part of the reason for that because there's a power dynamic at play? Because I have some power in this situation, and that's kind of reducing the cost to such a level where, yeah, X makes sense. But if I strip that power away, well, now maybe it's not so clear. That's the question I think we have to ask ourselves. And again, it doesn't guarantee it. There may be a power dynamic at play in your favor, but you still should do X. The point is to stop yourself and to ask the question. To question more, to check, to be sure, to make sure that's the case. Don't be so certain. Because I think often we're either consciously or subconsciously blind to that power dynamic. And we just think, well, everything adds up, so it's X. If we recognize, if we can see there's that power dynamic at play, I think that gives us that flag, that external instrument to check and make sure. And you see this, throughout history, and all different power dynamics at play where people make really horrible decisions, and sometimes well-intentioned, right? The whole cliche, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think this gets right to the heart of that. When you have that power, it takes away clarity. It messes with the equation in such a way where you can't be sure anymore. It's not to say that every person that's in a position of power, when they make decisions, they're wrong or they're bad, or that you always have to do the opposite again. That's not the point. None of this stuff is clean or easy. It's messy, it's nuanced, it's complex. The point I'm trying to make is when you can recognize and accept and acknowledge that you do have some power in a situation, you should be extra careful. Put extra scrutiny on the math there to make sure that that's not the only reason that's pushing you towards X. Pull that out of the equation. What does it look like now? If it's now obviously Y, well, now you gotta think here and you gotta figure it out. And you could look at this throughout history, right? You can look at it all sorts of different ways. But take, an obvious one, extreme one, but an obvious one is, take the 50s, right? Pre-civil rights era, how white people would act with black people. If you're walking down the street and a black person looks at you, there's stories of white people, spitting on them or calling them the N-word or worse, killing them, whatever it is, because there was no risk. The power in that equation worked out as such where they had the power and they could do whatever they wanted. Now, clearly it's wrong, clearly, right? And again, this is an extreme example where we're probably talking about evil people at play here, but even more subtle, even, microaggressions or more, I hesitate to say the word, but benign forms of racism where it's not so extreme. I think the same thing happens, right? It's so subtle in that case where sometimes the whole power dynamic isn't as clear and people act in a certain way. But what if that wasn't the case? Would the cost still look the same way? Would the equation work out the same way? So my point again in all of this is when you run into those situations where everything seems obvious, I should definitely do this. It's so obvious, right? This is where I should go. This is what I should do. Just ask a simple question. What role does power play in this? Is there a power dynamic in my favor here that's causing that equation to look so obvious that I should do that thing? And if it is, check a little further.